the reality is our Christian ecosystem has to stay alive somehow, right? And we've built a model that is very dependent and is fragile if we don't have these things. And it may cause us to overstate things that aren't true.
Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. Hey, today we are going to talk about the dismal state of evangelism. And I'm sitting down with Barna President David Kinnaman and Mark Matlock, an author, speaker, thinker, author of Faith for the Curious. And we're going to talk about why most churches really are not that good at evangelism. And this episode is part of a 5-episode series on the 5 disruptive church trends that will rule 2025. And to go along with the series, I've got a free leader guide, which includes all 5 trends in detail that you can download at 2025churchtrends.com. Again, that's 2025churchtrends.com. Like, subscribe, leave a comment to join in the conversation about the principles we cover in the interview. And now a word from today's sponsors, and then we'll dive into my conversation with David Kinnaman and Mark Matlock. This episode is brought to you by the Highly Productive Leader Challenge. So let's be honest. How has 2025 been shaping up so far? Well, if you're like a lot of leaders, the busyness of ministry has already taken over. New Year's resolutions are slipping. Everybody kind of forgot about that. Your calendar's packed. And there is no difference between this year and last year. Well, here's what most leaders get wrong. You don't have to wait until next January to fix this. So I decided to come in on February 3rd with a 4-week Highly Productive Leader Challenge. It's specifically designed for leaders like you who feel stuck in the cycle of overwhelm. Now, this isn't about sprinting at an unsustainable pace. It is about breaking free from the patterns that keep you too busy so that you can do what matters most. Through on-demand learning, group accountability, and live coaching with me, you will gain practical tools to finally get ahead on your priorities and start feeling inspired, not rushed. You'll be able to reclaim time for your family and personal life and make real progress on your goals without burning out. And each week, in just 60 to 90 minutes per week, you will take the steps toward becoming the leader you've always wanted to be: productive, impactful, and present. So it's not too late. You haven't blown 2025. This year, I'm hosting an exclusive live coaching session focused entirely on how to stay ahead in your sermon prep, where you will get practical strategies to stay ahead and stay inspired when writing your messages. So this is going to pay back all year long. You don't have to keep running on empty. Make February, not January, the turning point for your year in your ministry. How do you get in? Learn more and join today at productive2025.com. Again, that's productive2025.com to live and lead at your best. Today's episode is brought to you by Gloo. So let me ask you something. Have you ever wished there was an easier way to lead your people and connect with people in your church? Well, there is, and it's actually texting. Texting is the leadership solution so many church leaders have been missing. And with texting, you can save time by cutting down on long unanswered email threads and phone calls. You can make coordinating your volunteers, your staff, your event leaders a breeze, and you can communicate in a way that's less intrusive than phone calls and way more effective. And here's where it gets even better. With Gloo, you can create distinct groups for your volunteers, staff, event leaders, small group leaders, you name it, and you can send messages that feel personal, not generic. The best part, Gloo gives you, get this, 10,000 texts and 3 groups for free every month. That's right, no cost, no strings attached. So if you've been waiting, you can stop that and sign up for Gloo today at gloo.us/free texting. That's gloo.us/free texting. Gloo is spelled gloo.us/free texting. Well, David and Mark, welcome to the podcast. It's good to have you guys.
So good to be here.
Really good to be here.
So we're going to talk about spiritual openness. Mark, you've got your latest book, Faith for the Curious, which is, it's got some really interesting data, and I want to unpack that. But, it's easy, particularly in the middle of the culture wars, to think we're in an era of doom and gloom. But the argument with a lot of the Barna data is that we're in an era of spiritual openness. Do you want to talk, just set the climate, like how open are we, I guess is my opening question.
How open are we? David, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'll start. Well, I think it's been interesting because I remember growing up as a pastor's son And I always thought that the whole world was against us, at least here in America, and especially in Phoenix, Arizona. And my dad, Carey Kinnaman, amazing leader. And but growing up in a Christian home, you sort of feel like no one believes this stuff. But it turns out that most Americans have a Christian background. And what we're finding in the last 2-3 years is that there's, even among those who don't have a Christian background, there's just a tremendous amount of openness. 72% of Americans are spiritually open. And you can find on Barna.com more about the definitions behind that. But just basically, they describe themselves as spiritual. They believe there's a possibility for a supernatural world, that the reality of the material world is not all that there could be. And I just think this is a headline, even recognizing that with younger generations since the pandemic, we asked this interesting question, do you describe yourself as more open to God since the pandemic began or not? And young people, Gen Z and millennials, more than half say they're more open to God than before the pandemic. Older generations, boomers and Gen X are less than half say that's true. Only a third of boomers. So there's something happening across our society where maybe some of the pretenses have been stripped back. There's a real openness, whether it's even in entertainment, something like Stranger Things. People are open to the possibility that there's something beyond our sort of five senses.
Yet if you listen to the dialogue from a lot of church leaders, it feels like the culture's walked away, the culture is hostile, we're being persecuted. What's your take on that?
Well, I think, one of the problems that we have is that we are a culture that needs to fill seats and we need to raise money.
Okay, we're going to go there.
Okay.
Let's go there.
So
I'm good.
The reality is, in order to do that, sometimes painting a really terrible picture is the best picture to paint to motivate people to give. And that's the only thing I could find out. When I was doing a parenting workshop, I was trying to explain to parents of teenagers why this was actually a great time to be a teenager. Nobody agreed with me on it. And I was going through the data and showing like all these positive trends with flourishing among teenagers, opportunity, all this. And the parents would not believe it. It was just like, this was the worst time to be a teenager, so much worse than when they were a child. And I even had to change the seminar because it was so disruptive to them that they couldn't move forward.
They couldn't even hear the rest of what you had to say.
They couldn't hear the rest of what we were talking about. And I go, where is this coming from? So when I started looking about 7-8 years ago at some of the research we were doing at Barna, I'm going, there is this group of people. It started out to be about 80, 90 million, much larger than that as we're finding out, but that didn't fit the category of what everybody else was saying was happening with people outside the church. Mm-hmm. And then my own children, who are creatives that were going into adulthood, I started interacting with their friends and going, this is not matching up with the narrative that we're telling ourselves within the church. There is something happening here that is really unique. And during the pandemic, I had a lot of time to spend with non-Christians, and I got to go deep. And that's what kind of led me to kind of explore this idea of curiosity, because I saw that people were not necessarily interested in Christianity, but they were interested in spirituality, and that they were open to the idea of Christianity. So
I want to go pick up on that in a minute, but I want to go back to what you said. We got to fill seats and we got to raise money. What's underneath that?
Well, I think what's underneath that is, it's just the reality is our Christian ecosystem has to stay alive somehow, right? And we've built a model that is very dependent and is fragile if we don't have these things. And it may cause us to overstate things that aren't true.
Well, I think, David, it might have been an interview. You and I have worked together for so long. I seem to remember that it was an interview I did with you a number of years ago. We were interviewing someone very well known who interviewed somebody else very well known, and said, how do you raise all of this money? And his answer was, easy, have an enemy. Mm-hmm. Right? Do you remember that conversation?
I do.
Yeah, I'm not going to name names at this point, but it was really interesting. And that guy raised hundreds of millions of dollars in his lifetime. But it's like us against the world, us against the world. Why do you think that is such an attractive narrative for so many leaders? Because if you just follow certain channels on social media, certain people on social media, you're convinced the sky is falling, we're being persecuted, and we have to fight them. Culture wars.
Well, first let me take on the idea that simple binary or black and white answers don't actually work as well. And being a social researcher, it's been really interesting to see the number of atheists who say they pray, or the number of Christians who say they don't believe in God. That's not a majority, but that you start to take stock of these things.
So Christians who don't believe in God and atheists who pray.
Correct.
In other words, it's a more complex picture.
It's very complex.
And so when you start even just really simple social research, and you're saying, do the people that we're interviewing have a coherent way of seeing a biblical worldview? I mean, and as soon as you add just a few questions, Barna has been sometimes controversial because we'll talk about evangelicals or a biblical worldview or resilient disciples, and we've tried to, all right, hey, everyone is measuring born-again Christians, or we're talking about evangelicals by a certain set of measures, and using social research, as soon as you add just another layer, all of a sudden that number drops really significantly. And again, this notion that social research actually shows us there's quite a bit more in common among Americans than divides us, but media, social media, the algorithms kind of amplify those differences. So being a social researcher is a great privilege because you get to see a lot of the cracks, a lot of the nuances, a lot of the things between the stories. But coming to the second point, that I think, first of all, there is a scriptural model in talking about us versus the world. And, Jesus does it. There's strong language about, sin and evil and, the powers of darkness, and Paul does it. And I think the biggest thing is they're not raising money. Right? So I think part of the thing is how do we measure what it means to be faithful? And, I think the question that we have now as a set of ministry leaders is how do we authentically raise money? Because that is part of what Christian leaders need to do. But how do we do that in ways that, and how do we tell us versus them stories? Because there are places where, the God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers, and, they can't see the light of the gospel.
That's a great point. We do have an enemy. But that's not the enemy that we choose to raise money off of.
Okay.
What we've done is the God of this age has made us make enemies out of the people that we're supposed to be loving and reaching out to. And so we're putting them in the enemy spot rather than Satan himself. And in the process of doing it, the gospel's been hindered.
And sometimes those outcomes, I think that's partly what I would say is, in an era of databases and direct mail and fundraising appeals and all the good things that started with a good intent, television, radio ministries that are radio or television ministries, it's great to build an audience, it's great to build a constituent, it's great to build a church, but then at what cost, right? I mean, Jesus himself says, you might. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose their soul? And I think that's the tension we'd love to talk about here, is that notion of how do we actually follow an authentic path to ministry where we can be all about asking people for resources and supporting the cause, talking about the reality of living in a world where there is sin, there is brokenness, there is an adversary. The world itself can corrupt us. And I think, we want to talk about those important issues. But, when you start mixing the messaging with those outcomes, does the outcomes justify the ends? Do the means justify the ends? Or I should say that the opposite way. Do the ends justify the means? And so I think there's something about how important it is now in an era of radical transparency, where every single decision that we make as leaders is subject to a lot of criticism and a lot of openness. So how do we actually lead well in that context?
Mark, any other thoughts on filling the seats and raising the money?
I remember I wrote a book as Generation Z was just being born called Generation Hope. And I was looking at trends that were happening around the world, realizing this generation was going to become adults at a very unique time in the world that we're living in now, which is interesting to go back and read that from, 25 years ago. And I remember when I was sharing the book, a publisher said, "You're going to have to self-publish this." And he goes, "Nobody wants to buy Generation Hope. What they want to buy is, this is the last Christian generation." And so, and I remember sitting there thinking about compromise, right? And going, well, do I need to paint this uglier picture rather than this hopeful one? And I was like, boy, but then I'm just falling into this narrative that doesn't help the generation live into the moment that God has for them. And so I think it's a very difficult thing to do, but we have to really evaluate. And I think we do it without, I don't think there's a lot of malicious intent behind it. There may be some people that are really crafty that way, but I think most people really are believing that they're doing the right thing, and they don't realize that maybe they're actually impeding the gospel's work in the process of doing that.
I think there is research somewhere in here, and you can remind me, that talks about the difference between people who have an open mind and a closed mind. People who need definitive answers or closure on a topic, like here it is, boom, 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 versus, well, that's interesting. And I think, just so this doesn't get soundbited into something it's not. I think all of us here, biblical orthodoxy, belief in the resurrection of Jesus, that Jesus is God. We're not coming at this from a, I don't really know what I believe anymore perspective. Okay, so just that said, talk about an open mind versus a closed mind, and what the research is telling us about people in the church and outside the church.
Yeah. So we used two scales. One was a 2-factor scale to measure curiosity, which was basically we defined as being stretching, meaning that I'm doing things to explore the world around me, to seek out new experiences, interactions, engagements. So rather than every night I go to the same restaurant, order the same food, I look for new restaurants. That would be like one of those qualities of a stretching person. And then embracing this idea that I'm okay with there being uncertainty. I'm okay not having everything completely resolved. So I'm able to sit with it. So we use those two things to measure curiosity in a person. The other scale that we use is what I think you're referring to, which is a need for closure scale.
That's it. Need for closure.
Yeah. And the need for closure scale basically measured how comfortable we are with things not being wrapped up and being open-ended. And so, and it's more complex than that, but it's a lower tolerance for ambiguity. So, like, let's take art for example. A person who has a lower need for closure, a lower tolerance for need for closure, they're going to have abstract art that is very interesting to them. Things that maybe need a little definition, or I'm not really sure what they meant by that. I have to think about that a little bit to figure out where that goes. Whereas somebody who has a higher need for closure says, I want to know exactly what that artist is singing. I want to know what that painting is without any questions, right? And so there's a difference in the way that it comes out. And it just so happens that practicing Christians have a higher need for closure than those that are non-Christians, the general population of the U.S. as a whole, and among the spiritually curious that we looked at in the book, almost 20 percentage separation points higher need for closure. So it's a pretty big gap.
What's your take on that? Open versus closed, David?
Well, it's funny because Mark hasn't heard me say this before because I just thought about it, but it reminds me of Buzz and Woody. So Woody in the Toy Story has an openness.
I'm stealing this.
He has openness. He's lived in the world a little while. He realizes he's a toy. He's comfortable with some of the tensions about having to flop on the ground and not interact with the human world. And Buzz has a very low tolerance for ambiguity. He has a need for closure. Where's Zurg? He's got his space helmet on. You'll remember maybe that scene where Buzz, like, come on, man. He punches the button and whoosh, it goes up and he thinks he's going to die. And I think a lot of Christians, it's actually one of the things that I imagine sometimes when I go up and speak in front of an audience is that they're all Buzz Lightyear or in a Buzz Lightyear costume or with their spacesuit on. And I'm like, where can I find that button? Is it a stat? Is it a story? Is it my own story of grief and loss? Is it an unexpected moment where they find something humorous? Because people are there to hear a Barna guy talk about the stats and then I'll crack a joke or, whatever. And it's just like, no, we're all humans here. And like, let's hit that button, slow down. And I think one of the great privileges of my life has been helping because I've spent so much time talking about the challenges of this next generation, titling books called Unchristian and You Lost Me. Where I'm trying to help parents and grandparents and others who are so concerned about the next generation actually hit the button and be like, hey, things are going to be okay. God has this generation exactly where he wants them. Or when I think about that space suit, I'm like, I've got to find a way to get people beyond their bias about what they think is true. Like, for example, when people hear a stat that sounds right to them, they are preconditioned to believe that the methodology.
Oh yeah, I found my evidence.
The methodology. They never asked me a question about the methodology then. But then if it's the stat that doesn't make sense to them, they're like, yeah, well, what was your sample size? How did you ask the questions? And so even that reveals our bias. So I don't know. I think Buzz and Woody are kind of an interesting example.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it that way. That resonates.
Yeah, no, it's really true. And there's nothing wrong with having a high need for closure. I think that's really important to say. In fact,
some of it's personality type.
It's personality type. Yeah. It's a trait, but it is important to go, well, gee, if our churches tend to have a little more people that have higher need for closure in them, could that create an environment that isn't open to curiosity, that isn't welcoming to curiosity, that might even be a turnoff to curiosity?
Well, and there's certain jobs. I mean, you want your ambulance technician, your EMT, to have a high need for closure because they need to get you out of the car wreck, or they need to find the pulse, or they there are certain kinds of jobs. The pilot, you want a high need for closure. You got to hit the buttons. You got to do things. So I think there's both occupations. I think there's personality types. I think there's situations in life where that's actually really good to have a high need for closure. I just think that the real question is this question of how do we lean into what the Lord, the Holy Spirit, is asking us to do. And this actually tracks back to something we were talking about before about fundraising. Having an enemy is the high need for closure. Like, that's the thing. We're trying to solve it. And
they're bad, we're good.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And the spacesuit comes down. Here's how we're going to solve, we're going to solve all that toxic air out there. So the other thing to think about is, like, sometimes really good things which work, the problem isn't just that they work, but we keep going back to them because as a high need for closure, 1 year turns into 2 years, turns into a decade, turns into a lifetime of fundraising, which God bless fundraisers. But when you keep doing the same thing because that works, but it works without the Holy Spirit or God asking you to do it, that's where we start. Like, where is Zerg? How can we point our little red laser button at him? And I think that's part of what our invitation is. Whether you're a social researcher or Mark, who's just an expert at asking really good questions among the non-Christians, and I just seen him interact with my own kids and with others. He's a real master at inviting people into this warm conversation. And we're trying to help invite church leaders into the space that being a pastor, being a church leader is by nature, an exercise of ambiguity and of helping people come to a kind of closure on the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, which is the most important mission that any of us could be on.
I think one of the things that I see that concerns me is I think we're in a moment where a lot of church leaders are circling the wagons. It's like, we're in the culture wars. We got to protect what we have. We got to defend the faith. We got to get louder. We have to get stronger. We have to become more powerful. Meanwhile, the numbers continue, as far as engagement with the church, to trend downward. And yet there's an openness in the culture. So I guess the question would be, a lot of people who are Christians and say, there was a saying a lot of people had 25 years ago: God said it, I believe it, that settles it. Yep. Right? Probably
it's in my book.
It's in your book. There you go.
I had it on my wall as a kid. Yeah.
Did you really?
Oh yeah, it was. Yeah. My mom let me buy that at the Christian bookstore.
God settles it.
Yeah.
God said it. Yeah. I believe it. That settles it.
Yeah. Wasn't there a follow-up? Was like, God said it, that settles it?
Yeah. Probably. That's even better.
Yeah. Well, the problem was, and I think what led me into this whole thing is I'd go to school with that kind of an attitude and realize that none of my non-Christian friends had the same attitude.
Well, they didn't even have to understand the framework.
There was no plausibility for that worldview in their world, and so all of a sudden I'm going, wait a minute, this isn't working. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not there. That's not good enough for them.
There's one stat I read this year that almost made my eyes pop out of my head. It was 1% of pastors, and this is tremendous humility on the part of pastors. 1% of pastors agreed that our church is very effective at outreach. 1%, a single point. In other words, 99% couldn't check that box, which I'm like, that led to another trend. Evangelism is kind of on life support. We've been all about discipleship. I'm all for discipleship, but like,
So
And then
people always ask me, how do you know these pastors are telling the truth? Only 1%.
Yeah, exactly. That's like
it's not socially favorable to not answer that question.
Is anybody looking? Is anyone looking? I'm going to mark my ballot here. No, we're not very good. Which is like pastors tend to be hopelessly optimistic. It's like asking how often do you attend church? Pretty much every week. Well, let's look at the evidence. You were there twice last month, once the month before, that kind of thing. So, I mean, kudos to pastors for admitting it, but that's really concerning. And to be fair, I mean, we've been picking on people who are like picking on enemies and all that. Most of the pastors I know, vast majority, nobody got up today going, I hope we reach less people. I hope my neighbors don't come to faith.
That's why I got into this.
Yeah, exactly. I got into this so there could be fewer of us next week than there were last week. There's nobody's in that universe, right? So,
and we've all had the pain of that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we've all had the pain of that. Yeah.
So here's the divide. Culture is open. We're becoming arguably more closed, or those who are left are more closed, probably because we feel insecure, threatened, watched a lot of people leave over the years. How do you bridge the gap? Like, how do you begin to, bridge that divide between God said it, I believe it, that settles it, and a world going, so reincarnation, crystals, like, yeah, man, that's kind of cool.
Well, I think, what we have to realize is a lot of our evangelism methods were built at a time when there was a different plausibility in our culture. And so the idea of evangelism was, how do we efficiently communicate the message as quickly as possible with as many people as possible and make sure that we do it accurately? And the reality is we are never really taught about the real dynamics of how a person maybe processes their faith and how they deal with that. And that's harder to teach. I even had somebody who's very much an evangelist who wouldn't endorse my book because he felt people are going to think this is too much work. They're going to think there's too many nuances. I can't do this. And you need to make it easier, more straightforward, something they can do. And I'm like, I think this is more of what they can do, which is just living with people and doing life with people and recognizing what's going on. So I think we have to have a different frame. One is this idea that I don't have to close the deal with every person that I'm sharing my faith with. That the spiritual part of the journey that I intersect with their life may only be a moment, kind of like Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch, right? It was a moment for that, and then Philip's gone, right? And sometimes you have an encounter and you don't actually finish the deal, like the rich young ruler.
Well, if I don't close the deal, I don't get someone in my pew next Sunday.
Well, but also there's a huge burden on the person that is learning evangelism that I have to close the deal and make sure that they've clearly said they do not want this, right? And so we're working all of our spiritual conversations toward ends rather than being okay with them following themselves out. So I have a list of things that I want to do when I get to heaven. One of the top 5 things, I want to find out what happened to the rich young ruler.
He's one of my favorites.
It's such an interesting story, right? And he walks away and Jesus doesn't chase him down and go, hey, let's keep talking. We can get there. He lets him walk away, right? And for a lot of us, we're never taught that in evangelism. We're taught just find that argument, find that thing that they're disagreeing with, and you can get there with them, And Jesus has let him go. And I honestly believe as I read that passage that we are going to see the rich young ruler in the kingdom. I believe that he walked away, he processed, and at some point he was able to do the thing that was being asked of him and what was required of him. I honestly believe that's good. Like I said, one of the top 5 things, hey, Jesus, love you, thank you. And then it's going to be, what happened to the rich young ruler?
Yeah, where is he?
I'm really curious about, is he here? And because I'm always looking at those things going, how do we do that? And I think we also have to look at what's going on in the book of Acts, where we have the Jewish Christians that are trying to deal with what the Holy Spirit is up to. And the Gentiles are coming to faith. And they've been worshiping an idol. They've been, engaged in spiritual prostitution, all this crazy stuff. And now they're filled with the Holy Spirit and they are following Jesus. And there's this clash. Well, they're not circumcised. They're not this. They're not that. High need for closure. And so, the thing that I'm seeing with a lot of believers today, and I've been doing this long enough to see people come to faith and mature in faith, they become versions of themselves that could not reach the unsaved version of themselves.
Ooh.
That's a good one.
They become versions of themselves that could not save the unsaved version of themselves.
Right. They're they're so like I've got great fidelity to the word. My doctrine is correct. My life is in order. And I know what I need to expect of the other people around me. And I could no longer appeal, nor could I extend grace to my unsaved self. I'm just seeing it a lot. Mm-hmm. And it's just shocking to me that that's where our discipleship has taken us, is that it's taken us to a place of some crazy fidelity. And like you said at the beginning, we're not saying that, we believe in scripture, we believe in the resurrection.
Yeah. We're there.
Like we are orthodox in every way, shape, and form. But there is a way of living that out that is restrictive. And everything about Jesus was make it easy for people to come to me, and I will take care of them from that point on. And we haven't learned how to do that in this day and age. We want everybody to be sanctified, and then we will lead them to Jesus.
Yeah, convert your behavior, then we'll convert you. And Jesus seemed to have a very high tolerance for ambiguity, even to the point where his disciples are like, "What are you doing talking to a woman? What are you doing hanging out with this person? What about you don't need to waste your time with this person." Jesus is like, "No, I'm ready." Not sure we are. David, one of the premises is this question: is the church safe for curious people? What's your take on that?
Not especially. I mean, in a lot of ways, I want to give credit to pastors and to church communities. I mean, there is a lot of good stuff that is happening every week, and hundreds of thousands of church communities and small groups and discipleship and mentoring. Just lots of the church is still alive and active. So as we're talking about this, there's a lot of good stuff that's happening. At the same time, not really. We need a whole new set of skills to be able to understand and interact with a curious generation. We need to be able to help people think about the world that they're living in. By the way, one of the things that has shifted that didn't exist during the era of kind of mass evangelism and radio and television and sort of big crusades is that I think there's a greater awareness of among our society today, and then especially among young people, about the idea of kind of going back in time and reinterpreting the things that have happened to us and like, did I really mean that? So let me give you an example. We are hearing from more people who are deconstructing or who are going through their faith questions, and they go back in time and they say, I wonder what Christian school really did to me. The evangelical movement. And so when we talk about conversion, we're not just converting people sort of in a place and time. We have to convert, and just like they raise their hand, we actually have to convert their heart, mind, body, and soul. We have to help them understand the type of commitment they made. We hear other people say, I made this commitment to Christ, but I think it was just the chord progression during the music, and the lights were out, and I'm just not sure what it was I was signing up for. So like I'm on the board of a Christian institution, and we talk about it's a higher education institution. And we talk about being the scaffolding around these living stones, where we're trying to help as a body of Christ, like chip away at what God's trying to do in someone's life. But we realize they need to be Christian, not just in the now of their 18 to 23-year-old life, but they're going to be a Christian at 33 and 43 and 53 and 63. And so this notion of like how we convert people is about their whole life and about their understanding and excavating their past trauma and understanding how that has affected them. Understanding that people might actually come and say, did you make this decision for Christianity? Like a lot of the algorithms now are and sort of in some of the deconstruction space is like, did God really say? Did that evangelical community? Did that Christian school teacher tell you it's a 6,000-year-old earth? And I'm finding in our work with people who deconvert that they're going back in time and they're being asked to answer some questions that we didn't prepare them for when the music was just right and all the rest. So that's why I think it requires a different way of thinking about the conversion process, there is a moment in time, I believe, when we, come to a saving knowledge, to use that language, of what God has done for us on the cross, and that we don't deserve it, and that we are in deep need of a Savior. But we have to work hard at all of those different layers of helping people, be ready for when someone comes. Is that really, when Jesus talked about the parable of the seed on the path, and the birds are coming up and picking up the seed and say, is that what you really meant? Did you really make a commitment to this? Is this really true? And so I think that's a part. And so this whole new set of skills is required of us to help this generation, understand what it means to live into the totality of following Jesus in our lives today.
So we got a lot of business leaders listening, a lot of church leaders listening, and the business leaders are mostly involved in the Christian faith, probably in the church. You mentioned it's not one and done, one conversation, in the ride between the airport and my destination, the person gave his life to Christ. And I agree with that.
And but although that can be happen, and that's important.
Yeah, that can happen for sure. And it does happen. But when you engage the spiritually curious, let's start here. What are some of the adjustments you need to make? And let's start with the weekend service, because what do pastors think about the weekend service, the sermon? What changes do you think are helpful in terms of our weekend service? And I come out of 25 years of preaching to a church that was about 50 to 55% unchurched people, first-time guests. So this is my bread and butter. This is what I do. And there were constant adjustments, not in theology, not watering it down, but just in approach. Just in trying to have a conversation that says, hey, you're intelligent, you're probably thinking this, but have you thought about this, right? Little shifts like that, rather than here's why we're right, here's why you're wrong.
Well, one shift is to have as many testimonies from lay people as possible. And why we're seeing that in the research is that the idea of professional ministry leaders, which I am a firm believer in both theologically and practically, that we should be paid for our ministry work. But if you get a paycheck from a ministry organization, a church leader, you're conflicted.
You're not disqualified, but it's kind of well, of course you're going to say that.
I'm not saying that your conflicts aren't legitimate. I mean, you're not. You believe this, but the problem is that younger people, especially unchurched, they're like, well, this is why the criticism of money is so evergreen in our world, is that people see the paid ministry staff, and pastors on average don't make very much as a form of compensation. No one gets into it for the money, right?
Yeah, and stewardship campaigns cost you money because you're also contributing 100%. To it.
But what if to add to the work of professional ministry, we really embrace the idea of the priesthood of all believers and asked more frequently for lay people to tell their story, and we interviewed them in short little snippets. We do this a lot in different places, during the offering or whatever, but just integrate the testimony of lay people, because for a watching world, they will be like, oh, well, this person doesn't have anything to let Jesus' story, we overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the word of the testimony of the saints. Let saints who have been transformed by Jesus tell their story. And then furthermore, integrate as much as you possibly can. I know there's different traditions that listen in to a podcast like this, but as much as you feel appropriate within your tradition, and it might be more than you feel comfortable with, allow the Holy Spirit to work and prayer to work. Allow God to speak into the hearts of people. We were at an event together, the three of us, and we just heard a testimony of someone who was you remember Bianca was talking about this atheist who had come to her church and who had a healing in the service. And, God is still alive and active. And so that is another way for us to say, we're opening up a space here, not just for the program that we humans have created or for us who are professionals, but we are the people of God, alive to the work of Jesus in our lives. And we expect him to be a part of the times when we're together. And we are waiting and anticipating him to show up in that way. And we're seeing evidence all throughout the research that those kinds of experiences with God, with answered prayer, with the reality that, oh, these aren't just paid professionals. They're telling a story of their experience. They're talking. I just was interviewing Lisa Fields for a project, and she was saying, when we can talk as leaders out of our healed pain and how Jesus has helped us through our own trauma, like people are just hungry for that kind of story. So those are some things that I think are ways in the preaching and in the weekend services that we can make God alive to a spiritually curious generation.
Today's episode is brought to you by Thrive. So what makes a leader unforgettable? You know, it's not their title or their talent. Often it's their traits. So in a free 60-minute webinar, Mark Clark, a pastor at Bayside Church, will share the 5 essential traits that define truly great leaders. So whether you're leading a church, a team, or your family, you'll walk away with actionable strategies to inspire confidence, build trust, and create lasting impact. So don't miss this opportunity to learn from one of the most respected voices in leadership. Spaces are limited. Reserve yours now at thriveconference.org. That's thriveconference.org. That's a hard one for pastors to hear because I think most pastors are not in it for the money. They're not in it for the prestige. But you don't realize, it's kind of like me saying, you should listen to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast. Or you saying, David, hey, Barna research is pretty good, right? People are going to be like, well, of course you're going to say that. That's, look at my book. It's amazing, right? Of course we're going to say that. And that's not why we got into ministry. It is because we really are in love with Jesus and we really believe he is the hope of the world. But what was the stat? It's a Barna stat, like 46% of the congregation at some level mistrust their pastor, doesn't see their pastor as an authority. Can you nuance that a little bit? Like it was a little disheartening.
I don't remember the stat offhand, but I do think that the problem is one of distraction and one of indifference and one of credibility into the issues of life that a person from Monday through Saturday has to wrestle through. So again, I think the work of churches, the strength of the church in North America is stronger than any other developed nation in the world. And it is truly a miracle to see the strength of the church in the U.S. And it is in decline. It is facing a lot of pressure.
Yeah, if I could jump in, I think what we have to understand is that church right now is very much serving the congregants, and there's nothing wrong with that. And sometimes when we give something a dual purpose, those two things are in tension. And so I honestly believe that in order to reach this next generation, it may be that we have to provide halfway houses to the church, somewhere that they're able to experience Jesus or experience the questions they're having. I'm really a fan of the Alpha program.
I was going to say, is Alpha a halfway house?
Alpha's a halfway house. And in fact, a lot of what inspired Faith for Curious was watching a church implement Alpha for the first time and watching these congregants trying to lead these conversations. And they want to turn into a Bible study.
Alpha doesn't let you do that.
And you can't do that, right? And so that's not the point. That's not the journey that we're bringing these people on. And so I think finding other places outside of the service can be really helpful to helping onboard people that are curious about the faith.
So, we've had Nikki Gumbel on and others from Alpha, but what does Alpha do so well that all of us should be taking notes from?
Well, some of their principles, and we've actually done some research with Alpha looking at unchurched people and their expectations, but it is listening without judgment, one of the top needs of the unchurched, one of the ways I think Alpha orients towards hosting people. They don't force a conclusion. Some of the things we've been sort of a tolerance for ambiguity in the right ways, in the right application. Of course, they also do this sort of like, it's around the table. There's a hospitality orientation.
A lot of people say food is a big.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. So I think those are some of the things. But the research really underscores that when because there's a lot of good evidence in the work we've done for more than a decade, and even stretching for many decades with George Barna did a book called Evangelism That Works. And this notion that people are really hungry for something that is real. And when you can help introduce them to the realest thing, the truest story about ourselves, which is that our hope is found in Jesus, they can't help but be open to that. But we just have to be, willing participants in that process with them.
Yeah, I'd say 2 things. One is it's really hard when we read the scripture to understand how fully accepted, loved, and seen people who encountered Jesus Or like when they met him, right? The woman at the well, something is incredibly safe and remarkable in that moment that allows for that interaction to happen. It's hard to pick that up through the biblical text. So a lot of times we get into this whole, hey, we got to tell them the truth, even if it hurts. The truth hurts. The only way to love people is by telling them the honest truth. And what we don't realize is that there's an actual effective part of really caring about a person. In fact, one of the hardest things about writing Faith for the Curious was making sure that it was about really caring about the people and not just, this is a trick, this is a tactic, this is a technique you can use, this is a strategy you can use on Sunday that's going to get more people in your door, because those things don't embody the relational component that's required to reach the spiritual curious. And so I think Alpha creates a context whereby people over time realize, you really do care about me. You have heard me say some things that are hurtful to you, and yet you have endured on this journey with me. And somehow this allows them to see Jesus in a really powerful way. And I think the problem is a lot of times we're presenting Jesus as an idea. We're not presenting Jesus as a genuine relationship that we have. And so David's point about having people share their testimonies, have them share their experiences. Youth for Christ has a really wonderful model. It's actually become their logo. It's 3-story evangelism. I was involved in launching that at DCLA years and years ago. And the idea starts with, what is your story? So always assuming that somebody has a spiritual backstory or a journey that they're on. The second thing is, can I share with you my story? And then connecting their story to God's story. And it's a real simple model, but I think that is the way that we actually introduce people to Jesus, rather than saying, hey, here's the way the mechanics of the universe works. And Jesus offers a way out of that. I don't know that works in today's curious culture.
Well, and you hinted at it before, but I think, evangelism or apologetics, the way a lot of us were raised on it or heard about it, and it's still shared widely, is sort of based on the Enlightenment, rationalism, and an assumed framework that you've had something you once endorsed, you once believed, that you walked away from. Now I'm going to convince you why you need to go back. And that may have worked really well for a century or so. And that culture doesn't exist anymore. It's kind of went away. We're now probably not post-Christian, but in some generations pre-Christian, no idea about Jesus, depending on where you live. And they're not walking away from anything, and it's not a rationalistic framework anymore, right? As much as some of us wish it was, it's not.
And according to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, most people aren't sitting around feeling a lack of self-actualization.
Right.
Especially in North American context, people are feeling pretty fulfilled. And so one of the approaches that we have to look at in reaching the spiritually curious is that they are seeking, 74% of Americans tell us they want to grow spiritually. Okay, why? What are they looking for? It's actually not because they're lost in the universe and they're overwhelmed and they don't know what their purpose is. Most of it is there's something that they're doing that's really deeply satisfying, and they're trying to get more of that. And they're thinking that maybe spiritual growth, however that comes to them, is the way or the path toward wholeness. And so what I think that little thing is the image of God inside of them is broken because of sin, but it's there, a little remnant of it, and it's trying to get out. It's trying to grow bigger. And they're trying to, I want to experience more justice in the world. I want to be more compassionate. I want more intimacy. I want to be more creative. Whatever that thing is of the image of God in them that they're trying to see more of. And spirituality is a path to that, but it will never fully accomplish what they're really hoping for without Jesus. But if we start there, we have a common ground. Because if you're passionate about something that's a justice issue, I'm passionate about that. If you're a creative, I'm creative. If you're wanting more intimacy in your life, I want more intimacy in my life. And I found this path through my relationship with Jesus. By trusting him, I experience these things more fully. And so part of what I think needs to happen in our churches too is we need to make sure that people are really experiencing Jesus. Because David and I did at Faith for Exiles, we found that frequency of attendance did not necessarily equate to intimacy with Jesus. And so if I really have an intimate relationship with Jesus, people see it. I mean, one of the really interesting things happening to my wife and I right now is our kids' friends, as they're getting married, are coming out to us, asking us if we can either do their premarital counseling or if I can officiate their wedding. Many of them are not Christians. And exploring that, they're like, we see something in your marriage that we want in our own marriage.
Gosh, my wife and I are hearing that so much right now.
Yeah.
And our new generation of friends are all our kids' age.
Yeah. And so they're looking for the upgrade, right?
They are. They're like, what is it?
Something inside
you
me
guys
wants
are goals.
this marriage, wants this intimacy.
Well, we got a story. But,
Who do we see that's so we have to be examples of fruitfulness, and if we are examples of fruitfulness, the spiritually curious are going to go, how are you getting that?
Yeah.
And then we can say, we aren't doing anything. It's Jesus.
Well, and just
trusting in him.
Let's play this. You spent a lot of time here. We're recording this in Boulder, Colorado. I'm on a plane tomorrow to New York City for the weekend. These are very spiritual cities. I mean, you can walk 5 blocks in any direction here. You're going to see tarot card readings, psychics, crystals.
A lot of Buddhist.
A lot of Buddhist. Yeah, I passed a couple of meditation places yesterday.
You're also going to see a lot of deity-free spirituality, meditation studios, things of that nature as well.
Yeah, I'm sure on New York, if it wasn't winter, I would be out there and there'd be people exercising in the park, on Sunday morning, that kind of thing, runners clubs, etc. I mean, where do you see spirituality in the culture, David? Because it would be easy to come here and pull out our placards and go, this is Satanist, which arguably it could be. I mean, I don't know. But
it's Mars Hill.
Yeah,
it's like
it's Mars Hill.
My kids have friends that are tarot card readers. I've taken time to learn a little bit
I'm not comfortable with that.
about what's going on. I'll just go like, so what are you looking for? When you go to your tarot cards, what is it you're seeking? Like, what are you hoping to find? I'm genuinely curious about that. And they'll talk to me a little bit about what they're looking for or what they're leaning into. And this opens up a conversation around certainty, spiritual exploration, trust. And to be able to say, admire them and say, wow, you're really a spiritual person, right? Because that's what Paul said on Mars Hill. I see you're a very religious people. You've got idols to everything, even this unknown God. Let me tell you something about this unknown God that you worship, right? And so it's really interesting when we connect with people and we go, what do you get out of running? What do you get out of going to the meditation studio every week for 45 minutes a day, that you're paying $250 a session for? What is that doing for you?
What do you get out of hiking 14ers? And
Well,
David, any answers to that?
but I think that's kind of that's where we find common ground.
Yeah.
And that gives us a basis to have a spiritual conversation with somebody and introduce them to Jesus.
Well, first I was thinking when you said about Paul and his speech in Athens, like we do talks and listeners are, in boardrooms or in business settings or preachers, and you're like, hey, you crushed it. It's like, I wonder what the people after Paul gave that speech to the unknown God. They're like, oh, Paul, you just crushed that one.
They're going to be talking about this 2,000 years from now, man.
That one goes in the book.
That one goes in the
book. So that little image hit me. So, we see this in the research that people experience God in nature. That is a big one for sure. And that is for me, for sure. I do a lot of hiking you're referencing. I do a lot of the 14,000-foot peaks, especially in the summer here in Colorado. And that elevation, the perspective, the kind of exertion that's required, the planning, it's like it's my own kind of spiritual retreat, and I do a lot of praying and prep for it. And I think that elevation, one of my key words for this year has been elevation of just like perspective, going a little higher to see things. And I think people are hungry for that. And so, we live in a very spiritually drenched time, even entertainment, popular television and shows. It doesn't show up in the way that we Christians sometimes want it to, because we're not, in those places, but we get the chance at Barna to do a fair amount of work with people in the entertainment industry. We'd like to do even more in the coming years, where we can try to help talk about the market research about who are these Christians, who are these non-Christians, how might they want to be spoken to, what are the kinds of stories that they want to hear. So I think those are a couple different places that I see it. And I also follow a brand called School of Life, which comes out of the UK. And it's another place where I see spirituality, the kinds of questions that are happening on social media. This particular company called School of Life, it was started by the guy by the name of Alain de Botton, who is Swiss, lives in the UK, a secular guy, who basically said, listen, religion, philosophy, psychology, all these sort of humanities, art, they have something to teach us. We all can imagine there's no God, he's a naturalist. But we can actually learn some things about relationships and thriving and despair and who we're meant to be. It's like literally a curriculum for living in the modern age, but from a secular perspective. And I think that's a good. It's a really interesting brand to follow. They actually don't have any authored books. It's all sort of white labeled, meaning that you're not following a person, you're following the brand, which is actually a really interesting thing. So it's a good example of why people are going to CrossFit, or they're going to personal coaches, or they're going to tarot card readers or psychics, or why in the workplace they're trying to find meaning, because as the church broadly and institutional religion has declined in importance, people are placing more importance on these other places like the workplace, like reading a book on dating and relationships, but it's from a secular perspective. They're following social media influencers to say, how do I find a more meaningful life? Those are the expressions of spirituality in our time. And so the church can intersect those and say, this is, I can see you've got all these idols. I can see you're doing all these things that are good and meaningful. But what if there is an unknown way, a secret, mysterious way from the past called Christianity, following Jesus, that might actually reinterpret all of these things that you're doing towards a more whole life discipleship, more towards a more whole way to live your life. And I think this generation is hungry for that.
I think, and I want to touch on mental health, because the stats there just blew me away. Somehow I think these two conversations are related, mental health and spiritual.
It is an expression
openness.
of spirituality, yeah.
Yeah. So we talked about, I have what I would consider a historically orthodox understanding of Christianity and who Jesus is, and I know you too well enough to know that you would say the same thing. And there's almost a false dichotomy in the church where people would say, well, if I get a little more open, let's say there's still some people who would say, I have a high need for closure, who are listening, those who haven't turned off by now. And they're like, if I'm afraid if I become more open, I'm going to end up deconstructing, or I won't be faithful, or that somehow it's my mother's going to be rolling in her grave, or whatever that happens to be. How do you hold in tension a firm belief about what you know and believe to be true, and an openness to seeing where the world is exploring and trying to meet them there?
Well, Paul says he knows this one thing, Christ and Christ crucified, that he strives for that, right? Or Psalm 27, that this one thing I seek is to experience your beauty, the beauty of the Lord and His temple. And I think we need to immerse ourselves in Scripture, first of all, because they, I think, are invitations into this dynamic life with our Creator. And my story, my experience at every phase of my life and in different ways, but whether it's through bereavement and cancer, or whether it's through vocational journeys. I'm a very ambitious person, and I've found my heart's answer in the book of Ecclesiastes. I've found like in second Corinthians, God of all comfort comes to comfort those who are despairing. For 2 Corinthians 1 Paul says, we despaired of life, we thought we would die. So I think I just would give testimony to the a personal sort of story about the role of the Scriptures, the alive and active Word of God that has come into my life and saved me from myself. And it's the person and work of Jesus and the Scriptures have helped me do that. Have helped me to sort of put my heart back together. And then the community of God around me has helped me to do that in various times in my life. whether a new parent, or I remember actually coming after the first 3 or 4 months when Unchurched launched, and that was quite a rocket ship as Gabe Lyons and I launched that book. And, we started, we just were asked to come speak on that in a lot of places, a real privilege. But I remember coming back to my home church at a prayer night and just weeping out of almost fatigue and exhaustion. And I was inadequate to the task of trying to help the church grapple with the message of that book. And that church and Pastor Larry Reichart and that night, and just the tears themselves, the physical expression of feeling exhausted and almost like overwhelmed by, what God had asked us to do with that book. It was like the Lord was like, "Hey, I see you. Let's cry this one out. This was a hard journey. Yeah, you got asked to go speak in some cool places, but it's all right. Like God joined me in that." And so I think those are really important things for us to mark in our life, that God shows up and meets us in these places of deep need. And what a cool experience that we get to have to walk with Him in these days.
For me, we have to have confidence. One, the Holy Spirit is already at work. And so, when I'm talking to a person, especially somebody who's outside of the church, I'm going, where is God already at work in their life? Mm. So I'm trying to find those places because I believe that He already is, right? And it just so happens I happen to be sitting next to them on an airplane today. Just so happens that they're my waiter or waitress. It just so happens that, so I'm a part of this thing that God is doing in their life because He cares way more about them than I do. So I'm always looking for that. And then the Word of God, believing that that it is really powerful. So that in itself is an open thing that has nothing to do with belief, right? But it's a journey into the wonder. St. Augustine talked about the curiositas as being like this dark thing, that curiosity killed a cat, all this stuff, right? We have all these narratives of curiosity actually being a negative thing. And the reality is that it can be when it's rooted in our flesh. It can be a wonderful thing when it's rooted in our desire to experience more and more of God. And Paul wrote to the Thessalonians, he said, you guys, I brag about how much you love each other. Now I just want to encourage you, do it more and more. Mm-hmm. There is so much limitlessness to this. And I know for my wife and I, we think, oh my gosh, we've been married for 32 years. The intimacy that we know now is not, we thought we were in love when we first met, right? Yeah, but true. Now what we know is so much deeper. What could it be like in 10 more years? And so it's that idea that my love for Jesus, what it is now is nothing compared to what it probably can be. So that openness to explore and to be curious is not one of vice. It's one of intimacy with God and experience of God. And like I think some of the Jewish Christians in the early church, there was a sense of we've got this all figured out and buttoned down, and nope, Gentiles are bringing in this whole other way of understanding and experiencing the Lord, right? And we may be at that moment with Gen Z.
Well, openness and certainty are also not mutually exclusive ideas, right?
Correct.
So I think that's the other thing to
say more about that.
Well, I think it's. I'm not a philosopher, but it probably comes from more of an Enlightenment way of thinking where even as a survey researcher, we're trying to construct binaries or thoughts about, is it this or is it this? Like we have a survey question, are you more interested in openness or in certainty? And people say they're more interested in openness. 70%, 69% of Americans say they're more interested in a faith that is open than a faith that is certain. Well, even in the construction of the question, we've created kind of a false dichotomy.
I might have answered that one, certainty.
Yeah.
I want to know that Jesus rose from the dead.
Sure. But even the way we ask our questions, even the way we think about these concepts are reflecting a kind of zero-sum game, as though the more certainty, the more openness you have or the more curiosity, it must mean that you're lagging in your certainty. What Mark is describing is that he can, he can have this sort of like, his marriage can be he's working towards this vision of a marriage over many, many years. And that's actually what I was going to say. As you guys were talking about, your marriages, and we were sort of making eye contact about the notion that we've been friends for a long time. You guys have great marriages. We've talked about some challenges that you have been. I've been bereaved now, and so like now I'm single. And you guys know some of the challenges I've had in that. And here's the thing that is, I think, so important for us about this curious moment. And in fact, the testimony, what we can say about our faith is that God hasn't just walked through the great times with us, but he in fact has helped heal us and put us back together through thick and thin, through the worst that life can throw at us and the best that life can throw at us. And I think that's actually the kind of thing that people are really hungry for, is like, how has God, shown up in your life in ways, especially when things are really tough? Because we have a God who walks through suffering with us. We have a God who cares about our trauma. We have a high priest who, was beaten and flogged and understands the challenges that we face. I think that's really part of the witness of this moment. It's like people are actually, when it comes to mental health, like they want to know, is there a better way? Inner peace is a new apologetic, because this generation is so hungry to find a place of peace.
Inner peace is a new apologetic. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know what I'm going to do? Because it's been such a helpful conversation. I was going to spend 20 minutes on openness and then get into other subjects. It's been so good. I'm going to put a pin in mental health. I want to do a full episode 2, 3, 4 down the road on it. But let's conclude on that thought. Let's talk about the new apologetic. Say a little bit more about that, David or Mark.
I'd like to say something on certainty. Yeah. Certainty is not a relationship word. And I think that the church is having a problem right now, theologically, between a relationship with Jesus Christ and a belief in Christianity. And so certainty is something that happens, like, I have confidence in my wife. I don't have certainty in my wife.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean?
I have confidence. You're right. I have no idea. I think she texted me. I saw it when I was looking at my questions. Think she's at dinner with someone?
Yeah.
No certainty around that, but I have confidence that everything's going to be okay.
Yes. Yeah. And I think we have to start really looking at our words and our language, like grace. Grace is actually not a theological word. It is a relationship word. And we don't think about our relationship with Christ enough relationally. And to me, the essence of discipleship, what Jesus was trying to teach his disciples, was to trust him. And in so many discipleship programs that David and I have surveyed as we were writing Faith for Exiles and everything, so much of it was about teaching beliefs and making sure doctrine was in place, but none of it was around trust. So you have people, and what we're seeing in some of this deconstruction is they're going through and they're breaking down beliefs. But as soon as I start trying to bring a relationship with Jesus into the conversation, that's not even a part of it, because I can't deconstruct my wife. She's there, you know what I mean? And I can't say I don't believe in her anymore because she's there. And with Jesus, there's nothing to deconstruct if he's there and I'm trusting him and I'm seeing the fruitfulness of that. And inner peace comes from that confidence that we have in trusting and leaning with our full weight into Jesus in those different moments of our life. And the times that I fail is when I lean out of my relationship with Jesus and my trust, my confidence isn't there. It's on my own 2 feet and I start shaking and wobbling and I stumble and I fall. And so I think we have to think about that, because that's for me what openness is. It's like this opportunity to explore the extent of that confidence and the wonder of that. Certainty is a closed system. And every day, I have to have confidence in my wife. We have to have a renewed trust in our relationship. And the same thing's true in my relationship with Jesus as well.
So we've covered a lot. If there was one thing that you would say, because pastors are like, all right, I'm gonna really think about this. I'm gonna reframe. I'm open. I want to know more. But most of us are probably looking for, okay, where do I start? Like, what is one thing I could do that would at least move me a step closer to engaging with a culture that apparently is spiritually open and probably spiritually hungry? What's one thing they could do?
I think the first thing is just being curious about other people without having an agenda to lead them to faith. I have found that most of the time, spiritually curious people end up asking me to tell them how they can put their trust in Jesus.
Wow.
More than I have to introduce it, because I'm genuinely curious about their life and what they're exploring and what they're into. And I think that that's an easy place to start, genuinely being interested in the lives of others. And for pastors, it's really hard because vocationally we have our flock and we only have relational capacity, or biologically we are limited in how many relationships we can maintain. And so that is challenging. So we have to figure out, how do we make space for that? You know what I mean? A lot of our evangelism techniques were built to kind of cheat the limitations of our biology, right? So that's why I'll be one speaker in front of
stadiums.
Yes.
Yeah.
But if we're all doing the work in our neighborhoods and our communities and the people that we're coming in contact with, we have the capacity that we need to actually make the difference and the change. So I'd say that if I was a pastor, that would be the first thing, is find space. When I was younger, I was fascinated with an associate pastor of our church, Dr. Engel. He was a horticulturalist and he raised orchids. He even made a strain that he named after his wife, Ruth. I mean, how romantic is that, right? Say, this orchid flower never existed. It's named after you, right? Beautiful. Anyway, as a kid, he had test tubes and greenhouses and all this stuff. And I just thought this guy was like fascinating. And he left our church and took another assignment. And when I was a little bit older in my teenage years, my grandmother was sick and she said, "Hey, Dr. Engel is actually in a room 2 doors down." And so I went over and I visited him. And he said, "So Mark, what do you think you're going to do with your life?" And I go, "So, well, I thought about going into ministry." And he said, "Let me tell you something." He goes, "The thing that you and I always connected on was my orchids." And he goes, "And I always required the church to give me Thursday off to work with the Orchid Society, because that was my only connection with people outside the church." And he said, "If you ever find yourself in an all-Christian kind of situation like a ministry, find your Orchid Society." And so when I went to Biola University, I looked for my Orchid Society, and it was a magic club in Beverly Hills, California. And that was by magic, I mean like card tricks. Just to be clear. So there no
incantation.
It wasn't Hogwarts.
We're talking, David Copperfield stuff. And that was, for me, the place that I was able to connect on something that I was interested in, the faith wasn't always the central thing. And me being, potential missionary or minister was not the center of conversation. And I've always learned to have those spaces in my life. And I think it's important for pastors to have those spaces too, where it's not just that I have a set of friends over here. It's like a community that has nothing to do with the church, where you have a common ground experience.
Common interest.
Beyond that can be, and if you are genuinely curious about people, it will start changing. You will see God work in different ways. And pastors are smart enough to see the opportunity for their congregations, but they've got to get in the experience of it, right? I mean, we just have to break some of the cycles of what we're doing to experience it.
One of the things I've seen is a lot of pastors, that's really good, Mark.
It is.
One of the things I've seen is a lot of pastors and ministry leaders, as I talk about next generation dynamics, or, for years now, people will come up to me afterwards and say, "Wow, you're describing my 20-something and their world. And you've given me, we'll talk about, exiles in digital Babylon, that they're growing up in a world that's just more complicated, and let's have some compassion on that," or whatever. And I think that tells me something, that another practical toolkit is to really become immersed in the world of your kids and grandkids in a way that's like the Orchid Society. I love my kids and their friends. And it's like one of the highest compliments, like when one of Emily's friends was like, "Man, we love Dave," and just like, because I'm interested. One of them is from Bangladesh, and I asked him to read a book, and he's like, "Oh, you should read the Blood Telegram," and it's a little bit about the story of Bangladesh and Pakistan, and like, I was interested, I was curious about that. And I was like, so I think this idea of, and that relates to another idea is, ask someone to, like my sister, I was like, "Give me a book, any book for Christmas." And she gave me a book called The Midnight Library. And that was one of the best books I had read, a fiction book a few years ago. So this notion of allowing your time to be voted on by someone else. And for us, leaders, that's a big sacrifice, or we think it is.
It's outside of our control.
But it turns out that like it introduces you to a different lane of thinking. To be interested and curious in someone for its own right. And again, I have so much room to grow in that. I'd learn a lot from my friend Mark. But that's
so much to teach you.
I didn't think you were going to go there. That's awesome.
So those are some examples from my life of recognizing how interesting it is to read a book that someone else is really interested in for their own reasons. Like for Tausif, who's from Bangladesh, it's a deeply personal story about his family and all sorts of things. And those are examples, right, of letting someone else speak into our time, which is our most valuable commodity, to learn someone else's perspective and take that for what it is.
I love that it was personal for both of you. That's a great first step. So the book, where a lot of the research is and the ideas, some of which we barely touched on today, Faith for the Curious, Mark's new book, Mark Matlock. And then, David, there's a new initiative with Barna called State of the Church 2025. Some of the data in My Church Trends, some of the stuff that we talked about today, and a whole lot more is in there. Where can leaders go to learn more about State of the Church?
Barna.com is one place they can learn about some of the different trends that we're following, but stateofthechurch.com is where that whole initiative is housed. And we love working with our partners at Gloo. And what's great is we're pulling so many different partners and organizations together. There's trends, what's working, what's trending, what do we need to know? How do we actually build flourishing people and thriving churches is really the framework. So we would love to have you join us in that initiative, stateofthechurch.com.
All right. Thank you so much, Mark, David. Till next time. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening.